Hi, I'm absolutely delighted today to be introducing this asset-based community development concept. We're really privileged to have Cormac Russell from Nurture Development with us. We feel it's a massive opportunity to come together as partners in this, to really work out and work together on what we can achieve for our communities. There's some fantastic work already going on in our communities, and we want to now lift that to the next level as a real priority for us. One of the key things for me in this whole context was looking at that strength-based approaches to our work, and effectively how we can look at what's strong, not what's wrong. So I'm really delighted we're embarking on this. This is just the start of a journey. We're absolutely committed to it, and we're delighted to be working with Cormac Russell and his team at Nurture Development. Thank you.
Hello, good morning everybody. I'm sorry we're running a little bit late today. There's been some technical problems going on, so some of our colleagues have been unable to join us on the presenter side of things. However, there's well over 100 people joining us already, so we're going to go ahead and see how the morning develops. This is the third of our annual conferences that have the aim of bringing communities together and of finding new ways of working with unrecognised and hard to reach groups. Previous events have looked at issues of mental health and spirituality in later life, and also issues of ageing without children. And today at 2 o'clock, as a consequence of some of the conferences that we've held in the past, we have a national launch in partnership with the National Care Forum of our guide to recognising the issues of ageing without children in over 320 registered care homes across the UK. Today, we're looking at issues of asset-based community development, ABCD as it's known. As we come out of lockdown, we know that there's going to be visible and non-visible areas of trauma in communities. And as we seek to go back to what we call normal, we really want today to ask what was so great about normal anyway. We see today as a fantastic opportunity to bring together council and community together to look at not what we had, but what we want to be as part of Prama's vision for communities for all ages, as defined by the World Health Organization. So after a late kick-off, we will be joined at various parts during the next few hours by Cormac Russell. Cormac is our lead presenter today. He's the founder and director of Nurture Development Limited, which is an internationally recognised group that teach on ABCD modelling. And Cormac founded the concept and is promoting that today, and we've got a rich meal to look forward to from him. Cormac, over to you. Welcome on behalf of everybody across Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole. We're really looking forward to what you have to say.
That's great. Great to be with you, Steve, and great to be with everybody who's online. It's always a bit disconcerting when you're watching and you see people trying to do the technical side of things. So your compassion is welcome at this point. What we're really trying to do is have a conversation with each other. And I think Steve has very wisely reached out to all of the different parts of the system to try to curate a conversation that's about how do we build community from the ground up. Okay, and that builds clearly on a huge amount of work that you've all been involved in already. What I propose to do is, just to give you a sense of the schedule of the 2 hours, is to effectively do 2 presentations in 30-minute chunks. And in between, Steve is going to convene a panel discussion, which will, I suppose, unpack and help us digest some of the challenges and some of the possibilities, really, as much as challenges, that the whole idea of asset-based community development potentially presents. I think SJ is going to help me with the slides and moving slides on. So SJ, if we could go on to the next slide, that would be great. Great. So in terms of, my whole framing this morning is to say, let's think about the idea of outside agencies and how they can be useful to living Indigenous communities. So the question is, how can, if you like, outside professionals be useful, be helpful in precipitating community-led action? Now, an earlier question might be, why bother? Why build community of place? And I think the answer to that question is because the evidence is very, very clear that when people are more connected in place and living more interdependent natural lives in natural communities, they fare out better. There's some evidence here in the slideshow that shows you that people seeking jobs, seeking gainful employment or sustainable livelihoods are 4 times more likely to be able to find a job if they have a deep network. And that's not just a network of people who share the same condition as they do. I'm talking about a deep, interdependent, natural set of relationships in a community, variously understood, but including places. It's interesting when you take a place-based perspective and look at the likes of Somerset, for example, where over the course of a 3-year period from 2015 to 2018 saw a 29% increase in access to A&E and GPs surgeries. That what was happening in Frome, in the town, the village of Frome, because we were doing community building, was we were seeing something radically different happen. We were actually seeing a reduction in access to services. Now, I'm not about advocating for a reduction of services. What I'm about is highlighting the fact that in Frome, there were a lot of lonely people who were actually accessing services because they couldn't connect in communities. And when a community alternative was created to address their isolation, they were actually no longer in need of the service because they had their real needs met. They were actually connected. And this is a big issue. I think what we've done in public sector and third sector, and again, across a range of societies, is instead of addressing the issues of social isolation and the lack of social cohesion, we've kind of created solutions at the edge of those to try to address individual maladies. And I think one of the things that's interesting about what Steve is trying to do, and I think also particularly what Jane and Drew are trying to do, is they're trying to invite something that's much more rooted in place. I often say, if you've got placeless policies, you'll have rootless outcomes. So when you look at the evidence, it's telling us that we are safer, we are economically better off, and we are healthier if we can root what we do in place-based contexts and get that community cohesion. Sarah, if we could move on to Sarah Jane, if we could move on to the next slide, please. It's interesting as well in terms of care that most of the care that's provided to people across the life course, including at end of life, is care that's provided in non-service-based ways, so outside of service land. Something in the region of 90% plus of what we would understand how we live well to the end of life and recover when we're unwell is actually related more to our community associational life and not so much to big pharma or to professional intervention. This is really important. I'm not knocking the role of institutions here. I'm just saying the evidence and the epidemiology is really clear in telling us that it's our community assets that determine our health and safety, and not just the intervention of the GP or indeed the intervention of big pharma. The big problem, I think, is that what we're often dealing with is a narrative, a public narrative that says the only way my life is going to get better is if somebody from outside comes in to make it better. And if that's the narrative, then what we end up doing is in civil life, in civic life, as citizens, we end up saying basically that the role of the citizen is defined as that which happens after the important work of the expert is done. So we start believing that our health is in the hands of a doctor, that our child's education is in the hands of a teacher, that our safety is in the hands of a police officer. And actually, I'm going to guess there's many people on the call right now raising an eyebrow to what I'm saying and saying, yes, is it not? And actually, the evidence is clear, it's not. Unilaterally, the idea that our education, our welfare, and our safety is in the hands of the professional world will create 2 outcomes. 1, it will burn out our professionals, and 2, it will undermine the social capital of our communities. It's not either or. Of course, we need professionals, but we cannot ask the doctor to do our health and our living for us. We've got to find ways of building community life and institutional life in right relationship. I'm getting an awful lot of interference here, SJ, so I don't know if people have their there's volume, or it's all good here, is it? I don't, yeah. Okay. Next slide, SJ, please. So a lot of what I'm trying to do here is set up the panel conversation, and I suppose also the comments in the chat, which I hope you'll share generously with us. But I think the real issue often from a policy perspective is whether it's health or it's mental health, whether it's public safety or it's safety in the sense of law enforcement. We're often looking at issues in isolation of the environmental, political, and social fabric. And so, like in this slide, the psychologists are dealing with the symptoms that the koala is showing them, but they're refusing to recognize the issue of deforestation. And in many respects, it's often been my experience, I've worked in about 35 countries around the world, that if you get serious about the social isolation issues, a lot of the other issues become much, much easier to deal with. And my big critique of modernity and modern ways of trying to be helpful in public sector and third sector organizations, but particularly in public sector organizations, is they refuse to deal with the holistic nature of the challenge and are dealing with single issues all of the time, and particularly are interested in fixing problems. So they'll move much more quickly to a pathology in an individual than into a holistic analysis of the challenge afoot. So in many respects, what I suppose today's conversation is calling us all to is to pay attention to the forest and not just the symptom of the koala. Next slide, SJ, please. While SJ is getting organized there, just another thing perhaps to say on this is that in many respects, and again, it may be very different in your context, but in many respects, we just jumped a couple of slides ahead there, Sarah, but it seems like Sarah Jane, we're moving. Can we go back one slide, please?
Yeah. It's not only what's live is live.
No worries, I can speak to this one in any case. So in many respects, the challenge that we're facing in terms of figuring out how we can actually shape the public narrative, whether it's in relation to social care, public health, or public safety, is instead of trying to fix things, instead of moving in and rescuing what we think is the problem in the koala, how can we actually create much more space for communities themselves to be in a position to define what they feel the priorities are? And when I say community, I don't mean, just a handful of people who are not representative of their wider community. It's quite challenging in many regards to begin to lift up a relationship with community before we've taken the time to build community. So again, just recently, as the last couple of hours, I had a session with some folks in Singapore, and they kept asking the question from a population health perspective, because they're a hospital, how can we better engage with the community? And my answer to them was, you can't engage with the community until you first create the space for the community to be built. And largely what they mean by community engagement is not the same as what I mean. What they're talking about is essentially trying to engage a handful of sick people that they call patients in better patient care. So they want to get people to co-design services with them. They're not really interested in engaging with communities, or if they are, it's communities as defined by diagnosis or condition. Categories of people that they think of as patients who are defined by them in terms of their relationship to the hospital. But that's not the same as what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is getting beyond our institutional categories, getting beyond our institutional target groups, and actually dealing with indigenous living communities, variously described and understood. And I think that's one of the great dilemmas, that we've actually come in institutional life, particularly, to define community in quite odd ways, and even place. I mean, there are some primary care networks that are dealing with as many as 100,000 people and calling that place. Well, those 100,000 people do not think they're in the same place. And so one of the great challenges, I think, in terms of creating space for communities to make sense of what priorities they have, is we've also got to create space for communities to grow, to build cohesion, and to build a sense of what it means for them to define their own places and their own priorities. And that takes time. That's a huge challenge in the European context, where we spent about 40 years disinvesting from places and essentially taking away social fabric, and particularly removing really solid community development supports from places, and instead just working with target groups and working very much on a model of community development that's about pathology or is about organizing around condition. Now, again, it may be very different in your context, but I'm just giving you my report card from 31 countries, or 35 actually now, that also, it so happens over the last 15 years, extensively includes our experience in the UK context. SJ, are the slides behaving themselves? Can we move on? Excellent. So let's take a bigger view of this. This is a theory of change. I don't propose, by the way, to speak to this in great detail, but I'm happy to share the slides with you and you can review it yourself in your own time. But this is a theory of change that was developed by a Latino community in the US who were interested in addressing domestic violence. And one of the things that they began to realize in moving towards this model was that their old model didn't have community at the center. It had the issue at the center and the organization. And sadly, what that was doing was, in an effort to help women, largely it was women who were victims of domestic violence, they were in many respects disconnecting women from economic opportunities and creating a scenario whereby it was almost like case model social work, where they had professionals, very good professionals, who were coming alongside women and supporting them with the issues of domestic violence, but not necessarily supporting them with a whole range of other issues, including issues like having a sustainable livelihood, issues that went beyond domestic violence, but also included. And what they're trying to do in this model is to do something about that, to address the issues of domestic violence, as well as all of the other social determinants of health, including creating scenarios where women can have economic prosperity as part of their future. So looking at this moving forward, what really strikes me as interesting, and SJ, maybe you get us onto the next slide, is that we so often see this scenario where people are actually taking communities or neighborhoods and they're segmenting them like tangerines, effectively, where they take the youth at risk or the frail elderly or people experiencing domestic violence, and they segregate them. And then they aggregate them with other people who have the same challenges that they do, and then they provide services to them. And that model, insofar as it works, is just one way. Let's not even judge it as the right way or the wrong way, but it's just one way. It's also clear that it's a dominant way. And my sense of the future is, if that is the only way that we provide help, we are going to fail. It will not be adequate to carry us into the future. I'm not a great believer, like Steve has said, in this idea of going back to normal. Normal was not very good for a lot of people. I'm much more interested in flourishing forward fairly rather than building back better. But it's interesting to look at how communities are shifting away from segmenting to working with the juice. So let me share an example of this with you. This is a story from Colville in Leicestershire. And Colville, as some of you may know, is an old mining community, and over the course of time have suffered the ravages of moving beyond all of that and trying to figure out what their future might be. I worked with a number of residents who came on a training on ABCD and went back to their own community and decided that they wanted to have a very different conversation with their neighbours. So you see here in the press cutting, they asked the question of their neighbours when they returned, what are you prepared to do for Colville? So it's a pretty innocuous question, but it's really interesting when local residents ask other local residents what they want to contribute to the well-being of their community, the reaction that you get. Now, before we go on to the next slide, SJ, which I'm going to ask you to do in a moment, let me just say that I think most of the time what we're asking local communities is not what they want to do to contribute to the well-being of their community, but what they want to receive from agencies. It's a different conversation, right? Again, no judgment. There is a place for that conversation too, but it's equally true to say there's a place for this one. What do you want to contribute to the well-being of your community? So SJ, if you would, next slide. Here's a kind of a fun way of representing some of what they discovered. And again, we'll share these slides with you, and you can at your own, in your own time, look at the detail of this. But it's really interesting when you actually start tapping into the invisible treasure chest that's in neighborhoods, you start discovering that a lot of people are actually waiting to be asked this question. And when they're asked, they have a lot to say about what it is that they feel they could contribute to the well-being of their neighbors. Now, again, remember the evidence here that I started out with. And I made the point that if we could actually reweave the social capital in neighborhoods, there's a whole range of functions, a whole range of possibilities that become possible, that become available to us, that simply are not available when we do top-down interventionist ways of trying to help. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in the second presentation, but I just wanted to call your eye to this idea that most of the assets or the resources that are in communities are largely invisible. And in many respects, I think the work that we have before us is to make the invisible visible and then figure out how to connect and mobilize those assets. Next slide, SJ, please. I love the chutzpah of the local community in Colville when it comes to speaking to outside agencies. Essentially, as you see in this slide, they're inviting outside agencies almost to an interview where they're saying to funders, we're a confident, connected community with a lot that we can do ourselves. If you'd like to help us, come for an interview. We'll review what you have to offer and we'll see whether or not your investment is actually going to match our social capital. I love this idea because they're not being closed, they're not being parochial, so they're not putting a ring of steel around their community and saying nobody can get in and nobody can get out. This is not about building walls, right? It's about building doors and windows. But what they are saying is different than a grant-dependent community where they're saying, we won't be able to do anything until somebody comes in here and rescues us. They're saying there's a whole range of priorities, a whole range of things we'd like to do, and here's how you can be helpful. So in a sense, they're teaching outside agencies, including third sector organizations, how to be useful, how to be in right relationship with them. And this is a really important framing, if you like, and we learn most about the framing of right relationship from the work that we do with Indigenous communities in Canada, particularly in the US. So First Nations communities are really clear that the issue isn't about big government or small government or big society or small society. That's not the right framing. The right framing is how can we be in right relationship with each other? The institutional world has assets to offer. The community world has assets to offer. How do we get in respectful relationship where those can be collaboratively connected with each other? What does right relationship look like? And we'll talk a little bit more in the second presentation about that. But SJ, if we could, onto the next slide, please. Great. One of the ways that we can be powerful, and it's very much Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this idea of being self-actualized, is we can discover our own strengths and then, we can build on them, if you like, invest on them, go to university if that's our good fortune, or go and do an apprenticeship. We can personally develop. If I'm a singer, for example, I can go and I can personally develop my voice. But in other ways, I can join a choir. I can enhance my associational life. And again, as a choir of singers, there are things that we can do together that I cannot do on my own as a singer. Now, one of the things that we know is that if you're interested in building power and building a sense of agency in community life, the best way to do that is build associational life. The rule of thumb is if I'm 65, I'm in my 50s, but if I'm 65 and I have one association, one club or group that I'm a member of, and I have a twin brother who is 65 and has none, that I'm likely to live 4 to 5 years longer than he is. Now, there's lots of other variables, but the point is that associational life is good for your health and for your longevity in ways that a pharmacological intervention or indeed a medical intervention more broadly understood cannot simply create those kinds of outcomes for you. So one of the big questions, whether you're coming at this from a health perspective or you're coming at this from a safety perspective, or you're just a community person. And when I say just, I mean just in the sense of you're at the heart of the action. One of the questions that we really need to think about here is, how do we build associational life? Okay, why is it that so often we're focused on either changing individuals and behavior change, or trying to reform our institutions? But in the middle, the associational piece gets very, very little attention. And one of the things that we want to try to do in today's panels and in our discussions is, how do we get serious about building associational life, particularly in places, but not just. I know that there are many people on the call who are building associational life through park run groups and through peer recovery groups and so forth. I recognize that too. But how do we build that associational life and really open up that space? So it's not just a matter of behavior change in individuals, which has been really promoted very strongly in the UK over the last 10 years. And it's not just a matter of reforming the institutions. Both of those things are important. But in a sense, what I'm describing here is almost like a middle way where we say community also matters. And this picture that you see here is an example of all of the different associations that are in a community. One of the challenges, I think, is the way funding is currently organized in Europe, and I see it in the UK, particularly in my own country, Ireland, as well, is it's very much organized in such a way that we create competition between associations. So if you have 5 local football groups in a community, in a neighborhood, we're basically asking them to prove why one should get funding over the other 4. And so in a sense, we're pitting our associations against each other through the way that we fund community life. And what I'm really interested in is, how might we go in a different direction? So instead of having associations fighting with each other or saying to associations, you all have to be the member of a local forum, that we create a situation where community is about an association of associations, where associations can actually be in right relationship with each other. SJ, if you can hear me, could we move on to the next slide? We're going to do some pretty rapid moving through the slides now, and we'll go to the panel discussion then. So I want to share with you 8 key principles of community life and of asset-based community development in particular. And then we're going to stop, and hopefully we'll be able to have a panel discussion with Steve, myself, and others at that point. Okay, so let me go reasonably quickly. And Steve, just so you have a sense of where we are and the timing stakes, I expect to be finished this presentation in about 8 to 10 minutes time. Okay, so the first principle of the 8 is that the neighborhood is the primary unit of change, not the individual and not the institution. Doesn't mean the individuals aren't important, doesn't mean the institutions aren't important, but in ABCD terms, we see the neighborhood as a really important unit of change, because that's potentially where individual assets, associational assets, economic assets, cultural assets, and the assets of the place itself, the environmental assets, all come together potentially. And it's also interestingly where all the different agencies can get out of their silos and actually start working together. There's a lot we don't agree on. You know, we're working in specialisms, we're working in silos. I often say silos are where smart people go to do dumb things, but we can all agree that we have common places and spaces we care about. So if we really started looking at that as a primary unit of change, I think a lot would change as a result. SJ, let's go on. And again, next slide. So the next principle I want to share is the principle of focusing on what's strong, not what's wrong. This doesn't mean we ignore problems. It means that if we're serious about addressing problems, we need everybody's strengths at the table. And centrally importantly, we need community strengths at the table. If we're constantly defining communities as backwaters of pathology and places that need to be fixed, rather than places that actually are centrally important in creating the solution, we're going to end up with outside-in, top-down, institutionally led solutions. If we're serious about democracy, where citizens are at the center and community life matters, then the principle of starting with what's strong is absolutely critical, absolutely critical. We can then use what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong even stronger. Next slide, SJ. I think one of the challenges in starting with community and community strengths is it takes time to discover, connect, and mobilize those strengths and to build the confidence and build the capacity of community. And because so much of our effort goes into building scale and efficiency and measurability in the institutional world, we're often going at the speed of a funding cycle or an election cycle rather than the speed of trust. And so the second principle that I would share with you today is the principle of going at the speed of trust. That's where community is built. And we need to figure out that. I think that means going in terms of decades, not years. I think that means going at a generational cycle of change and not just trying to do things over a 3-year funding cycle. Most 3-year funding cycles spend a year getting started, a year delivering, and a year winding down. I think we could do so much better if we went at the speed of trust. So we need to change the gear of change itself. Next slide, SJ. One of the other challenges is that we're often focused on individual agency, trying to help individuals get better. So the third principle is try to focus on collective agency as well as individual agency. Really start figuring out how we can create much more collective agency in neighborhoods and in communities variously understood. Next slide, SJ. The principle here is about placemaking and really getting as close to people's doorsteps as possible. So getting within mother-sized kind of levels of work, you know, where we're in pram pushing distance of the change making. Most of what people care about, they care about quite close to their own doorstep. You know, I think about, I'm from Dublin. It's got a population in the inner core of about 450,000. And the Greater Dublin area, the GDA, is something like 1.1 million. So if somebody says to me, Cormac, you're a citizen of the city of Dublin, what are you going to do about that? I'm not so sure what I can contribute to that party. But if somebody says, well, Cormac, you live in Clonskee, which is a neighbourhood in Dublin, it's got a population of about 5,000, and you live on Bird Avenue, and we're in the middle of a lockdown here, and there's 15 people who are isolated at the moment, what are you going to do about that? Now, I've got a sense of what I can do about that. So I think scale really matters. And one of the great challenges is so often we're trying to make change happen at a scale that most people can't actually relate to. They can't show up to. So the only way that they can really contribute is if they vote, if they volunteer, or if they actually become an advisor on a committee. And I think we could do so much more if we enable placemaking and we enable change making at people's local level. My sense of it is that everybody has something to contribute to changing their communities, but not everybody wants to volunteer. Not everybody wants to be involved in meetings, and not everybody wants to be an advisor. So how do we create the conditions within which people can, contribute in multiple different ways? SJ, if we could go on to the next. So another principle here, and I'd mentioned this earlier on when I was talking about right relationship, is that if democracy worked the way democracy should, we would see an awful lot more civic engagement and an awful lot more civic participation. So much more of a sense of communities being in the driving seat and stuff being done by communities together with their neighbors. We're not seeing that in a lot of places. And I think the reason is probably because people have become quite dependent on outside folks. So there's kind of a story, if you like, that says the only way things are going to get better for me is if somebody from outside comes in to make it better. And yet we know time and time again that it's when people have a sense of collective agency and a sense of self-determination and a sense of solidarity. We've seen this during the pandemic. That's when things change. If you look at what happened this time last year in your neighborhoods and your communities, what you would have seen was that largely a sleeping giant awoke in response to COVID. Local people started getting organized into solidarity groups, and it was largely led by the people, with supplementary support by agencies, excellent support by agencies, coming in, cheering on, bringing in and doing for communities what they couldn't do for themselves. But communities were very fundamentally in March and April the first responders. And so it's really, really critical to recognize this. This is not in any way to demean the role of professionals, but it is to decenter it and say, in a democracy, the role of the professional is defined as that which happens after the important work of citizens is done. In a technocracy, the role of citizens is defined as that which happens after the professional has done his work or her work. So we're trying to really think about what does a democracy look like? And I think it looks like this. Next slide, SJ. One of the hopes that I have for the panel discussions is that we talk about the principle of power. In an awful lot of communities, the relationship has been around grant funding or giving outside agencies information. You can see it here on the ladder of power. In the lowest rung of the ladder is where communities can only think about their future in terms of what funding is available. So we'll only do things if it meets the funding criteria. So I would describe that as a grant-dependent community. We won't act unless there's funding to act. Okay, I'm not against funding, but if that's the mindset, if that's the belief, it's very hard to build power. All you have to do to destroy the power of that community is pull the funding away. And an awful lot of the kind of change that's required here, well, quite frankly, as the kind of catchphrase goes, this revolution won't be funded. There's a whole range of things for which there just is no funding. But if the funding is there, it should be done on the basis of enabling community priorities, not telling the community what they should care about and then giving them the funding and then auditing them to see if they've actually complied with the criteria. That's just not the right relationship. That's a child to, or an adult to child relationship. And really what this power ladder is suggesting is let's move further on up. Let's stop just treating communities as sources of information or even people that we invite to our boardroom table. And instead, let's try to support communities to be more in the driving seat and be good guests in their lives, where we're at their kitchen table by invitation as guests serving them rather than defining them in terms of their relationship to us. So it really just turns the whole narrative on its head. Next slide, SJ, please. We're coming near the end now, and what I wanted to just say as we conclude is you could summarize everything that I've shared in this presentation with these three questions. And I often think of these questions as almost like a highway, where you have 3 lanes. And essentially, as we think about flourishing forward fairly, the first lane that we need to start in is what is it the communities themselves want to do and what assets can they use to do it? The second lane is, again, sticking with community priorities. What is it communities want to do and what outside help would support them to do it even better. And then the final lane is, what do outside agencies have to do for communities? Now, my basic thesis throughout this presentation is we're stuck in the third lane. You may not be. I don't know enough about your context. That's what we're going to find out in the panel discussion. But my thesis is most of the places that I've been in are locked into the third lane question, and they're not taking enough time to find out what the communities want to do themselves or what they want to do with just a little help. They're so obsessed with their own services and their own programs and their own criteria that they're not actually being good guests in the lives of the people they serve. Final slide. SJ, please. Okay, so in closing, I would say we're talking about a shift away from trying to make everything about a delivery of a service, more to a discovery of the assets and the resources that are in community as a starting point, and then use services to supplement those assets. That's the first shift. The second shift we're talking about is moving away from, trying to promote our content or our political agendas, much more to making contact and relationships matter most first, and really listening to what the community care about. And then I think the final shift is that shift away from starting with what's wrong and fixing what we think is broken Britain to starting with what's strong and really revealing and illuminating the abundance of brilliant Britain. I'll stop there, Steve, and hand over to you.
Cormac, thank you very much. There's such a lot to think about there. I understand that you've got some questions that you have prepared for the attendees. So if you could start thinking about those, then SJ will be able to put them out to the community. But whilst you're thinking about that, if I can just ask a few bits and pieces. One of the things that occurred to me that as you were speaking was this principle of power, in the fact that you can never really give power away. People can only take power. It's something that power is something that comes from the community itself. It's everything other than that is just patronizing. And so I was thinking about the nature of language in what you say and how what we use as language, we professionalize out communities, and how do we present what we want to do? How do we, which is in itself is the wrong thing, how do we present the way that we think we should be going forward in a way that is inclusive by using the right sorts of language that stops it just being a professional approach?
That's a brilliant question. I think one of the things that often strikes me as problematic with the way we frame our whole narrative is the word empowerment. And so we'll often answer your kind of question, Steve, by saying, well, we've got to move to an empowerment model, right? But the difficulty is if I empower you, as you say, I'm the one with the power and I'm giving it to you, which means I can just as easily take it back. So I think we need to really think about ourselves, if we're trying to be useful outsiders, much more in the context of how do we create the climate within which people start to really discover their individual and their collective power. And a lot of that is about not just doing things, but also agreeing what we're not going to do to be helpful. So much of how we take or we disrupt maybe or disturb people's power is we start taking on functions that don't belong to us, or we start solving problems that don't belong to us. And this is why the questions that I'm really keen on people thinking about were the questions near the end, the very last three questions, just as a cue to SJ, in that last slide. When we think about the different things that we're trying to address and be helpful around as outside agencies, really thinking about what it is that communities are best placed to do, that we actually need to move away and give them space to do. If you think about that first lane, a lot of what we're really trying to do here is remove barriers so that people can connect and discover the power that you're describing in local communities. And if people have been professionalized, and if they doubt that they have any power, then we need to figure out how we're going to do the work to address those issues.
Thank you. One of the other things, speaking from what I my limited knowledge of how councils work, would be a concern about efficiency. If you've got a whole load of little initiatives all over the place, where does strategy come in, and where does the efficiency, because local councils are accountable to taxpayers for how they spend their money, and if they're not using corporate strategies to address areas of inequality and all the other words that we use, how do councils assess something in terms of whether it's an efficient use or whether it's a sensible use of funding to promote work?
Well, you're right. There are three priorities that every council tends to, in my experience and research, academically elevate more than any other. So the first is efficiency, the second is scalability, and the third is measurability. So essentially, they'd be the three criteria by which they measure most everything that they do. How efficient is it? How scalable is it? And can we measure it? You know, how are we going to know that we're having impact? So I think in relation to how we might do this kind of work that we're describing here today, the critical thing is to understand that efficiency has to be a measure between what we put into the effort and what we get out the other side. And so, for example, we're involved in a lot of different work at the moment where we're trying to encourage people during the pandemic to engage in vaccination drives and so on and so forth. Now, we have many different roads that we could take to that, and you can create false impressions of efficiency. But in many regards, if we can't get people to participate across all ethnicities in the vaccine drive, well, you know, then we have to ask what it is we're putting into that and what we're getting out the other end. Now, it's very interesting in my mind when we stop measuring the quality of our programs and we start measuring quality of life and social capital, and that we make that our measure of efficiency, we get very different discussions going. So recently in Bristol, I've been inviting people in the third sector, the public sector, to shift away from thinking about efficiency in terms of how many people, how many clients you can get onto programs for as little money as possible, to thinking about how do we create the conditions within which people live much more interdependent lives in natural communities outside of these programs. Now, if that's your efficiency drive, so efficiency looks like more people living natural interdependent lives in communities where they're reciprocal. In other words, they're contributing as well as receiving. Then I think you would understand measurability and scalability in very, very different terms. So I think the big problem is that the efficiency drive in the UK and in other countries has driven us towards two things. One, making the third sector a proxy for community. So essentially, we're asking the third sector to be kind of a conduit for public sector funding and driving programs into the community and essentially finding need, instead of enabling the third sector to be the community development precipitant that enables communities to grow stronger. So I think the efficiency drive has been a really, really big problem in driving us away from a place-based response and into a much more instrumental, what I would call quick fix response.
Thank you. We've had a question come in. Is ABCD an opportunity for councils and governments to divest their responsibility to be servants of the people? What could be the impact upon local councils if local areas are doing everything for themselves?
Okay, so it's really important that somebody has asked that question. So thank you, first of all, for asking it. And the answer, because it's nuanced, the answer is, first of all, a top level, no. It's not the opportunity for local governments to hit and run, right? It's not an opportunity for people to create a veil for cuts. And it's not an opportunity to divest responsibility, okay? What it's an opportunity to do is to stop being colonial and stop taking on responsibilities that don't belong to you, and stop being paternalistic and stop trying to fix problems that you actually are not qualified to fix in the first place. So if you go back to the 3-lane highway, I'm not saying step back so far that you abandon communities. I'm saying step back far enough so you see the abundance of communities. Now, that's an act of humility, not an act of abandonment. But it would be an act of supreme hubris to assume that councils can solve everything unilaterally. They can't. There are whole sets of things that can be solved by communities. And I would say that the role of the council is not to step back and do nothing, but to step back and to precipitate those competencies in the community, and to recognize that a council isn't just about the provision of services. I think one of the great tragedies of the commons is that local government have become so much like businesses. They're in the business of providing programs and services, but local government's also a steward of democracy. And as I understand democracy, democracy is measured by the extent to which, you see people showing up as citizens and taking collective action. That isn't just about providing services to passive clients. That's about activating and animating communities and enabling communities to respond. So it's not either or. It's a much more sophisticated and a much more nuanced approach, which says there are certain things that communities can do, and we're going to precipitate the community to be able to do those things. There are things that they can do with a little help. We're going to help them. And there are things that we as a council still must do, and we are going to maintain our responsibility. And actually, by doing the first two things I've described, we'll be in a better position to ethically spend the money the way it should be spent, and to execute our responsibilities in an adult to adult, citizen to citizen, democratic way. And I think at the moment, that's the challenge. It's much more nuanced than either or.
So what steps are we able to take in joining up services, including the fire service, the police, the health and local authorities, to work together to change our collective approach to how we fund and support community and voluntary assets?
Well, I think one of the first things that perhaps is important to say here is that what we're really ultimately trying to do is not join up services, we're trying to join up residents and their associations. So it's really, really critical that if agencies are joining up, if they understand what they're joining up to do. Because what we've seen in co-production's a case in point, we've seen agencies kind of gather together and say, let's all work in partnership, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But we need to be clear about what we're working in partnership to do. So often it's work in partnership so we can provide better services to our clients. And that's fine insofar as it goes. But I think we need to be really clear on the why of the partnership. Sometimes, if you look very closely at behavior around partnership, it's pretty clear in my mind that most partnerships are the mutual suppression of loathing in pursuit of government funding, right? So let's get real for a second and let's actually look at behavior. So if we look at what would people who are paid and have the privilege of serving members of the public do? Talk about the fire services, talk about police, etc. Well, one of the first things we do is we probably all recognize, as for example, I'm just going to give you examples here because it's the best way to articulate this. In Milwaukee, after the police killing of George Floyd in another city of the US, we began to see a willingness on the part of institutions to recognize structural racism and to want to do something that went beyond siloed thinking. So in Milwaukee, traditionally before George Floyd's tragic death and the death of others, I think the view would have been, on the part of the police chief, I have a budget and I'm going to spend that budget in terms of keeping crime at a minimum. And, I have a certain portion of that which I might spend in neighborhood policing. But it will always be the crumbs of the captain's table, if you like. Now, what has shifted in the last few months, which I think is really of consequence here, and it speaks to the question, is that the police chief is working with the director of public health, is working with the director in the city around social care and mental health, and sitting down and saying, why is it that all of us can say to each other that it's the same 15 neighborhoods in the city that produce the alumni in terms of the folks that we serve? So, the same 15 cities produce the vast majority of people in our prisons. The same neighborhoods are producing the vast majority of people with mental health issues, with food sovereignty issues, and so on and so forth, right? And so they're sitting down, and the privilege of being alongside a number of them, and saying, what if instead of looking at the crime that's emerging from these 15 neighborhoods, we started thinking about it in terms of this is contemporaries, with the likes of poverty, with issues of health. We actually took a public health lens to this. And what is happening is the police chief is relocating budget from her own departments, and she's moving it upstream to enable the employment of community builders in those neighborhoods so that the communities can start addressing the social cohesion issues and the social isolation issues and the poverty and the social justice issues, which are at the heart of so much of what comes out as the symptom called crime. And so here I think we're seeing somebody who's taking seriously the stewardship role of being a public leader and being in a public office and saying, this isn't about protecting my budget and continuing to operate out of my silo and my specialism, but it's beginning to think much more holistically and much more collaboratively. So whether it's neighborhood pool budgets, it's employing community builders, it's having a matching fund scheme that precipitates neighborhood action. There's a million different possibilities, but until we get that mindset in play, it's very hard to even entertain those possibilities. So that's the way I'd answer that question, Steve.
Councillor Butler asks, how did Colville get their communication out to their residents? Because this isn't just a change of strategy, this is a change of culture and a change of identity, not just a different corporate plan.
I love that question, because I think it goes to the heart of what needs to change, and what we need to change is our practice. And absolutely, I agree. It's about culture change. So a couple of things I think are worth lifting up. The first is they actually got out on the streets, knocked on doors, and talked with their neighbors. So this is an embodied thing where it isn't just talking conceptually or in abstract meetings about what we're going to do. They got out and they actually started having conversations in the bumping places and in the gathering places of their local community. And I suppose what was critical was they asked different questions. So the questions weren't about what was wrong and what was broken and, give me a shopping list of things that you need and I'll take them to the council. But they were questions about, what do you care about around here, and what would you be prepared to actually invest in that, and how do we connect you with others? So very much getting out and having a different conversation. And we can talk in more detail about how to do that, but that's the critical piece. So this is more about practice and less about policy. The idea here is once we get some traction on the ground and get more and more people engaged, that the practice will inform the policy. And that's the way it should be. The problem at the moment is we're trying to use policy to inform practice, and it's actually the wrong way around.
One of the issues I think that scares me, to be honest, about moving to this model is this something that only the loud voices will win on? And how do people who are living in what we would call disenfranchised, rural, isolated communities, how would they feel? What would their role be in this? How do we reach people who we would class as vulnerable or isolated or disempowered? How do we reach those people, and how do we encourage them to take part? And the second one that's linked to that is, what happens if things happen that we don't approve of? We live in an age of information, but we also live in an age of misinformation. And so you could run the risk of groups being set up that are just completely out there. How do you exercise any form of control or moral judgment within this?
So the first question, Steve, around how do we make sure that this is radically inclusive is, and again, it kind of speaks to the second question. So we insist on it being, So if you think about it, Ku Klux Klan is a community, but it's not a community I want to be part of. It's a closed, aggressive, violent, exclusory community. And ABCD really is about measuring the success of community life by the extent to which the stranger is welcomed at the edge. So we're not measuring the strength of groups by how vocal or how competent or even how elegant and eloquent their leader is, but the depth of associational life and the willingness of those associations to welcome the stranger at the edge. So how do we do that? Well, one of the ways we do that is spending time. I talked about going at the speed of trust and investing in places and recognizing it's very hard for volunteers often or local residents to do this on their own. But there are very, very skilled people called community builders who are trained in ABCD who know how to actually reach to the edge, reach out to people who are exiled. And in some of our communities, we have situations where we have houses, with maybe 6 to 12 people with mental health issues that are like islands in our communities where their voices are never heard. They're hardly ever seen. They live almost, we call it care in the community, but in fact, there's neither care nor community in these places. I'm sure the staff are very caring. I don't mean it in that sense, but their voices and their contributions are not connected into our community lives. And so I think the work, and we've seen this, I can give you oodles of examples, but one example that just springs to mind for me, actually I'll give you two just to be kind of diverse about it, is in the work that we did with the NHS Ayrshire and Arran Trust. And interestingly, they took 300,000 from their endowment and they employed 6 or 7 community builders who were trained in ABCD to go into 7 neighborhoods, in South Ayrshire. And largely their work was to do what you were describing, to reach out to people who were isolated. And one example that comes to mind is the work of including residential homes, these places where people are looking out windows at you and you wonder what they are. They're living in houses that look like yours, but they're not. And to actually begin to blur the lines and open up and create permeability around the circles so that their voices can be heard. In our work in Javastraat, which is a street in the Netherlands in Amsterdam, we came across a chap by the name of Joop who had profound agoraphobia, so he was afraid of social contact and being outside. He lived with his mother. But his great gift in life was he loved plants. And we were able to support him to become known in the community as the person that looks after your plants when you go on holidays. So, there are different connections, and we've got to find entry points that go at the speed of the person, but also find ways of connecting that person's voice. So I think that's absolutely critical. I think that's first principles. And ABCD at its heart is defined by the welcome for the stranger at the edge. The second question, just remind me again how you framed that, because you had a very particular way of framing that, Steve. So I want to make sure I answer it properly.
This was about how do you deal with the angry voices, the voices that are in a world of disinformation, and how do we work our way through that in a better way? What's the best political way through that? Because communities need to be working cohesively.
So I'm going to say something that's a bit controversial here, and I want to say it in the context of saying that it's a metaphor. But if you take community as a body, right, and the body has a part which stops growing, right? It just it closes in on itself. Our word to describe that is a cancer, right? It stops growing. It's the opposite of growing. It's kind of moving into entropy. Some communities have stopped growing, quite frankly. They're not opening up to new possibilities, new voices. They kind of closed in on themselves. It's the opposite of community, I would say. And so a big part of what we're interested in is how do you deal with that? Now, the way to deal with that is not to attack that issue head on, but to strengthen the cells. If you go back to the metaphor of the body, you don't attack the cancer head on and just kind of outshout the shouters. What you do is you grow the cells around it. So what we have found is that the challenge, it's nobody's fault that you have gatekeepers or that you have people who are kind of holding the line. I think that's not their fault, and there's no point in pathologizing them or blaming them. But I think the solution is to grow the cells around them, to actually get more associational life, to get out. You see, the big problem is 85% of the way we engage with communities politically is through meetings. Why have a meeting when you can have a party? So the very way that we engage with communities alienates about 85% of the population who won't go to meetings because that's not the way they show up. That's not the way they contribute. If we were able to find other ways politically of enabling people to be civically active, I think what we would find is not so much that we would crowd out the shouting voices, but we would basically change the tenor of the conversation. One of the other issues is that I think so often political life is about the exchange of opinions rather than the exchange of commitment. You know, what we're really trying to understand in the ABCD conversation is what do people care about enough to act upon, rather than what are people's opinions around what you should act on. And most political consultation is asking the community to give you a shopping list and tell you what the public sector, the third sector, or the elected members should do. And I think it's very interesting when you actually say to somebody who's shouting at you that you're failing them in terms of their consumer rights, you say that's may well be the case, but change your complaint into a request. Tell me what it is you want. And when you actually get into the conversation around what it is they want, you'll find some of what they want cannot be unilaterally done by anybody other than them and their neighbors. And I think it's a very valid question, if you're a steward of democracy, to confront people compassionately with their own citizenship and say, there's some stuff that the council can do on our own. There's some stuff we can do with you, and there's some stuff you can do yourself. And our job is to figure out how we actually organize all of that. And I think the shouters are in the third lane, basically answering the third question that I described earlier on.
It's a difficult time nationally, and we've had a comment come in saying trust is very damaged locally. And I think this is something that probably doesn't just apply within this area, it applies nationally, that there is some degree of a breakdown, there is a tension. As I mentioned at the start, there is a trauma that's developing within society. When is this the right time to do things, or when is there a good time to do stuff, or is it best just to jump straight in?
Well, it's like the old environmentalists' response to when's the best time to plant a tree. There's two answers. The first time is now, and the second is 20 years ago. So I think holding off on investing in social capital is just storing up more and more issues, which the system can't respond to unilaterally. Personally, my view would be that there's no time to lose. Would be the answer. So the question of trauma and the question of trust, it is very, very clear that there has been a very, very significant breakdown of trust right across the board. And I think that's particularly acute among groups that have been marginalized and minority groups. And I think the issues that surround that shouldn't be ignored. We can't, they cannot be silently, addressed in a corner. They have to be brought out into the public domain. But it does feel to me like trust grows when social capital and the agency grows. And so there's something about, I think trust grows when we say to people, we trust you. Most communities don't care what councils know until they know that they care. And it's funny, I think we've tried to use, a kind of the social contract that we're trying to use to build trust is to say, you tell us as a consumer what it is you need, we'll provide it in a timely fashion, and to a standardized model, so you get the exact same as everybody else, and that will grow trust. Well, the jury is in on that model. It hasn't worked, because actually, a bit like any human being, if you just treat human beings as though they're solely the recipients of what you do to them or for them, or even with them, and you don't trust that they can also be creators and producers and doers, then they won't trust you either. That's the bottom line. And here's the interesting thing. I think it isn't just an issue that, citizens don't trust agencies. You asked a question earlier on, Steve, which was all about, well, what happens if communities just go crazy, if they start kind of setting up far right or alt right groups and whatever? And actually, that's a valid question, because I think institutions are profoundly distrustful of communities, profoundly, and communities know this. So there's a tension either way here. But I think a lot of the tension comes down to our views on things. I'm mindful of our time. I don't know if you want me to go into a second presentation, or it's worth sharing an example of a local authority that I think did a good job. Yeah. So I think a local authority that did a very good job of illustrating trust, both within its own organization, because of course, there's a blurry line here, isn't there? I mean, many local authorities employ people who live in communities who themselves are residents of those communities. So there's lots of grey in this conversation. But just to take you over the other side of the border, from South Ayrshire to East Ayrshire, and to the wonderful work, and I have UK examples as well that I'll share later. England-based examples that I'll share later also. So there's different examples from across the UK. But Katie Kelly in East Ayrshire, she's the Deputy Chief Executive there in East Ayrshire. She was really mindful of this issue of trust, and she also had a great insight. She said that she felt that maybe she didn't really trust her own staff, or illustrate the level of trust in her staff that she wanted to illustrate. And so she set up what she called the Vibrant Neighbourhoods team, which was essentially about 100, I think, at the time, around about 2013, they first formed, about 100 staff from all kinds of different sections of the organization. So she intentionally recruited from across the silos of local government and formed this team of people. And largely her criteria was, do you have community in your heart? Do you have a heart for community? So it sounds much better in a Scottish accent. And she found the people who were maybe behind reception desks, people who were in waste management, in all sorts of different places. She found folks who were just really, really trusted by the community. Because of course, I think trust is a very personal thing. We might say, I don't trust the council. And yet Jimmy, who comes and sorts out the parking, yeah, he's fine. He's different. Yeah. So it tends to be quite personal, doesn't it? So she had that insight that there were people who were naturally oriented to being good guests in the lives of the communities they served. And if they were freed up to actually do that, then they themselves could do a lot of the trust building in communities. She also then realized, as they were freed up, that they found when they went into communities, there was a lot of distrust in communities themselves. A lot of old history, Mary remembered Johnny's husband who, was not so nice and, chaired a group and was totalitarian and whatever. And so they never forget each other. All of that all those history and fault lines exist. So I think what she did, which was very useful, was she said to communities, we're going to trust you to create your own neighborhood visions. And we're going to give you the resource to build, a peace build essentially, to build the connections and to work through the conflicts and to work through the loud voices and the voices at the edge and figure all of that out over a few years. So we're not going to rush you, and we're not going to measure you in this kind of instrumental way. We're going to cheer you on. And across the last, 2021 now, across the last 7-8 years, I think it's now 17 neighborhoods have created their own neighborhood vision, where they're really clear in the thousands about how they're going to contribute what they can bring to their parish, whether it's rural or urban, what it is they need help with from outside, and what they expect the council to do for them. And it's really changed the nature of the conversation and the nature of trust in the relationships.
I'm very struck that you're talking effectively about a change of words from efficiency and authority. John Sloper here comments that instead using words like trial and failure and forgiveness and community and acceptance, what you might call the softer words, rather than the harsh business efficiency words that we've sort of fallen into over the years. I'm also very conscious that this is a starter as opposed to a final presentation. It's an initial thought. And I'm conscious that there will be a process that we will be starting to engage in, talking to the third sector, talking to council and local authorities, talking even maybe to local communities. Who knows how far this madness could go. But over to you, your second presentation.
That's great, Steve. I love that point around language. You know, there's a world in a word. And so when we use certain words, we are immediately pretty much defining whether we're serious about building community life, or we're, you know, I often use the metaphor of Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall. So we're either we're on the side of the king's horses and king's men, trying to put Humpty back together again, or we've jumped the wall. You know, you can literally jump the wall with a word. And you can create a new picture, a new image, a new moral imagination by saying, had you ever imagined that there was a nest on the other side of the wall? And if you had the choice between Humpty Dumpty falling into a nest and being caught and hatching in a natural community, or falling into service land, and maybe, who knows, the king's horses and king's men will eventually figure it out. I doubt it. But then you're in a different conversation. You're in a different space. So words really matter. I totally agree, particularly if we mean them. You know, so if we're not just using them to manipulate, but if we're serious about and meaningful in our words, then yeah, we do open up new spaces. That's for sure. Yes, Jay. Let's jump through a few of these slides. We're going to the first one just really quickly. Why does this conversation matter? You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. In 2003, we had a heat wave, and 70,000 people died across Europe in that heat wave. Something in the region of 15,000 died in France, which is interesting given the quality, I think, of their healthcare system. I think it's very, very good in France, I would say. Not to make a judgment on anywhere else, but I think it's pretty good. And you'd imagine that during a heat wave, it was August of 2003, that they'd be particularly well placed, actually, you know, by comparison with Eastern European countries, for example, to respond to a heat wave. In Paris, 5,000 people died. And to Steve's point around people on the margins, most of the people who died they were women, living in isolation, over the age of 65, in substandard urban housing, right? So these were if you like, the variables or the determinants of whether people lived or died. It's very disturbing. And now actually we're seeing the exact same thing happen in Paris at the moment, again. So what's that all about? Is that a failure of the system? Is that a failure of the institutional world? Poor social care, poor health? Well, actually, we've now had quite a significant number of years to study the 2003 heatwave phenomenon, particularly to study the city of Paris and what happened. And what we found is that it wasn't necessarily a failure of the system, albeit that for that 2 weeks in Paris, a lot of professionals do clear out of the city. And in fact, it was people in the mortuaries that discovered the nature of the crisis, the intensity of the crisis first. But it wasn't just that. At the heart of what we saw happen, across Europe was, I think, evidence that we have a very, very significant reduction in the level of social cohesion in our neighborhoods. And at certain key times, we see how serious a problem that is. And at other times, we just get on with business as usual and we can't see it. So heat waves and pandemics create a kind of an act, like the word apocalypse means to be able to see things that you cannot see when there isn't an apocalypse. That's what it means. So it's an act of revelation. So heat waves and pandemics are revelatory. They help us see things that are hard to see at any other time. And we should pay very close attention. Very close attention. So all of that said, I think, the community building is often a matter of life and death in a heat wave or in a pandemic. And we're pretty clear that pandemics are particularly harmful to certain socioeconomic groups in certain communities. SJ, let's move on. So this is why power matters. If we're saying to communities, this top rung of the ladder where residents are in control of some things, not everything, we're not asking them to take the waste management system in charge, but they're in control of things like, for example, they're chief of loneliness. Like, if you want to address loneliness, you don't do that with a pill. You don't do that with a doctor's intervention. The antidote to loneliness is community. So in many respects, we want to relocate authority and say to communities, there's whole sets of things that you can do that the systems world can't. And we want to absolutely set you up for success in those regards. And this might be an uncommon idea, the idea that communities have functions, but they do. And in heat waves and in pandemics, if they're not the first responders, as we have heard over and over again, and we're seeing now in India, the system will be overrun because the system cannot unilaterally live our lives for us. And it's interesting, actually, when you listen to people in a trusted relationship, what people constantly say to us is, I want a life and not just a service. I want the service to supplement my life, not to replace it. So people are not looking to be institutionalized. They're looking for natural community life with good services to back them up. And that's a really important thing to say. Now, an institution, a professional, no matter how good they are and how well funded they may be, cannot do that unilaterally. It's interesting, in our work in Chicago with the police departments there, our evidence base across 17 years of studies in the 77 neighborhoods in Chicago is that two key determinants of safety in some of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods came down to how many people you knew by first name in your neighborhood, how many residents you knew by first name that you could call on, and how often you guys did things in the public environment that were visible so that people could see that you were programming the civic space. There wasn't just a vacuum for anybody to fill. That's a really, really important point. SJ, let's move on. So I talked earlier on about these three questions, and now I'm giving the metaphor of the 3-lane highway. And what I'm basically saying is, as well as changing words, I'm advocating we change the public narrative. And instead of saying, community is better than institutions or institutions are better than community, I'm saying let's not do that. That's binary. Let's instead ask the question, what's the optimal sequence by which everybody fares out better? And I'm saying the optimal sequence is to say there's certain things on the first lane communities can do themselves. Let's get out of their way. Let's stop obstructing them or, demeaning them or patronizing them. And let's actually set them up for success. The second lane, there's things that we can do together with communities. Let's call it co-production. Let's crack on, but let's be humble in that space. That is not about policing and governing. Yes, of course we should have governance. Yes, of course there should be transparency. But if we want creativity and commitment, then it cannot be about compliance. It cannot be about saying, for example, in terms of the pandemic, here's a set of rules, comply with them and you'll all be fine. And then, the heroes kind of get into battle dress and go out on their white steeds to save the day and fight against this evil virus. That's nonsense. It's childish and it actually isn't working. Much better that we create the conditions where we say, how do we actually create a relationship that's about genuine collaboration, where your creativity and your commitment are as important as ours. And we're not comparing credentials or doing a parade of curriculum vitae, but we're actually thinking about the assets and the contributions, as like a treasure chest that we're dipping into. And the final lane is important. Of course, there are things that institutions can do. I do not want my neighbor operating on me if I get an angina attack on the street tomorrow, you know? Nice neighbors, I love them to bits, but there's certain things I do not want them to do. And if somebody said to me tomorrow morning, knocked on my door and said, we've got 15 neighbors who want you to get involved in taking the waste management system of the neighborhood in charge, I'd say, do you know what? Forget about it. I'm very happy that my council can do that. I may grumble and complain on the days that the bins aren't collected, but largely I'm happy for the system to do that. And that's not something I want to be involved in. So it's trying to understand those three lanes and their relationship. So for me, it's a matter of sequence rather than balance. And one of the difficulties, I think, is, and I've seen this a lot in the UK with a lot of national narratives around ABCD and, community paradigm and so on. They're trying to make it an either or a balance. And I don't think that's helpful. Politically, I think it's a nightmare, So politically, I think we need to be saying that this is not about either or. It's not about communitarianism or communism or socialism versus, capitalism. I wouldn't make it about that. It's much more rudimentary. It's much more rudimentary. There's certain things you and your family and your community can do. And actually, you don't want us in your bedroom, in your house, or in your neighborhood. Our job is to create a dome of protection around you so you can crack on and do that and feel good about that. But there are other things we need to work together on. Let's figure them out. Now, here's the key insight, I think. I don't think we can understand politically or at an executive level. So, in terms of working out how we divvy out the resources, I don't think we can understand what it is communities need us to do for them until we first understand what it is communities have. In other words, you can't know what a community needs until a community first knows what it has. And if you think about it, perhaps many of you this weekend did an online shop, I guess, but you will have looked to see what was in your refrigerator and in your pantry, in your cupboards. And you'd have said, well, we've got ketchup, we don't need that. We have whatever, we don't. But what you would do is you would do an inventory of assets first, and then from there you'd figure out what you need to put on your shopping list. I would want to convey to you a huge concern that I have, that I think that what local governments are doing to communities in the UK is they're saying to communities, ignore what's in your refrigerator, what's in your pantries, and what's in your cupboards, and instead tell us what's missing. So we can then look at what's in ours and give it to you. And for me, I think that's the opposite of democracy. And politically, it may create very quick wins, because you're kind of saying, well, we're building trust that way. But in the longer term, it's about the best way I know to break trust and to actually damage social capital. So the long game, even though it's a slower game, will create much more enduring trust. Next slide, please, SJ. So these three questions are at the heart of what we've been talking about. Next slide, SJ. And, you might want to, because sometimes it's nice to pause and have your own kind of reflection, but you might want to think, well, what does this mean for me in my role? And somebody asked this wonderful question earlier on saying, this isn't just about policy change, it's about culture change. And I think that's right. And it's also about practice change. If we want to change our practices, we've got to practice change. And some of that is about what would you have to do in your own role, whether you're listening here as a local resident, as a member of the third sector, as a member of the faith sector, the business sector, as a member of the public sector. What would you have to do to shift in the orientation of saying, I'm not just going to treat people as consumers. I'm actually going to start thinking about what is it they want to contribute. Think about them as doers and not just consumers. And then what dilemmas would that surface for you? I think that's really important. And Steve was making the point that this isn't a benediction conversation, it's a commencement address. So this begins I think a much longer process of conversation with you about not just getting you to agree with ABCD. I'm not interested in that, I'm interested in, let's look at your context and the dilemmas that this surfaces for you and how we can work through those dilemmas So you can figure out a way of doing this that makes sense in your context, right? Rather than taking a model. I often say that all models are wrong. Some are useful. So I don't think ABCD is a model. I think it's a framework. It's loose enough for people to kind of say, okay, this is useful. Now let's figure out what it means to us in our context. So beginning to think about it at that level is really important. Next slide, SJ, please. So another way of thinking about what I'm saying is to consider it as a challenge to the way that we help people. I like this because it takes it out of the political domain and out of the service domain. Everybody at one level or another is trying to be helpful, you know. So how are we helping people? And is some of what we do to be helpful actually harmful? Let's go to the next slide. So some of you may have seen this, but it's just a simple way of describing 4 modes of being helpful. And I think in times past, a lot of councils and indeed some bigger institutions in the third sector were very much about either doing things to people or for people. So it was almost a parody where you had the public sector doing things to people and the third sector doing things for people, and both of them kind of comparing levels of virtue with each other, talking about the community rather than actually building up the community. And it feels to me like the next level, which we're in right now, is the width. So you hear a lot about co-production and co-design, and that's wonderful. But what we're talking about brings us to a 4th modality of change. And that's where we go back to first principles, go back to an old school way of thinking and say, yes, it's great that we do things for people when they need things done for them. And sometimes you need to do things to people. You know, if somebody's breaking the law, you've got to arrest them to keep, you know, the greater good in check. And it's wonderful that we're also doing co-production. I think that's great. I'm celebrating that. But there's a whole set of things that actually need to be led by communities, you know, where they're organizing. And sadly, I think that's more sophisticated than having a residents association or a neighborhood watch. And I mean no disrespect to them. But I think if we're talking about enabling the community at neighborhood level, do things by themselves, we need to think about much more dynamic ways of enabling them to be in relationship and contribute. And it feels for me 12 people rocking up with good spirit and good heart, you know, spending 27 years going to weekly meetings and trying to do their best for the neighborhood, but aging out essentially and really struggling to get membership is not a model for the future. This is not going to sustain. I mean, I can feel the creaking of residents associations and neighborhood watches, and I know they're doing their best. But even if they're being honest with themselves, they must recognize that representation needs to go so much further. So representativeness isn't just about the whole level of a number of people who are elected onto a residents association. It's got to be about participation. And I think that participation has to be about more and more people being involved in the buy space. Next slide, SJ, please. So the thesis here is that we've moved away from doing things to and for people. Perhaps there's still more work to be done. I think that's true. And we're moving more into the width space. Next slide, SJ. Sorry, I'm keeping you busy here. But the buy space is the most marginal space. It's the space that needs most nurturing, that we need to cheer on most, that we need to invest life in. And here's the killer. I mean, this is the kicker, and I'm sorry to say this, but social prescribing is not going to be the answer. You know, one of the challenges is we have local area coordination, we have social prescribing, we have time banking, we have a whole range of ways of trying to enable people to be in reciprocal relationship with each other. And that's fine insofar as it goes. But if we keep referring people into associational life and not actually lifting up and building up those associations, I think we'll just burn the associations that are there out. So I'm not knocking social prescribing, but I think as well as social prescribing and all of those other models like circles of support and so on, that we know our friends in social care are, you know, commissioning and housing and so forth are commissioning, and good for them. It's good that they're commissioning. But if they're commissioning those without the grounding of good neighborhood work, then it'll be a bit like having apps without a smartphone. So we need to find a way of building a much more coherent relationship between what's done by, done with, done for, and done to. Next slide, SJ, please. Next slide again. So again, we haven't a huge amount of time here, and I'm going to just crack on in about the next 7 minutes to finish so that Steve and I can have a conversation and go through your questions, because I think that's what's most critical. But I would ask you to think about this. Whether you're coming at this from a political perspective, a paid role, a civic role, where are you spending most of your time? Are you spending most of your time doing things to people, for people, with people, or enabling people to do things by themselves and then supplementing that with and for as needs be, you know? So another way of asking that question is, how often do you try to solve problems that don't belong to you? There's a principle in political life called subsidiarity, which says that no bigger entity will do that which the smaller entity can do, even if the smaller entity doesn't do it as well. So part of the principle here is that we've got to allow local entities fail, make mistakes, and be prepared to have the robust challenge, push back and join in. So if we're seeing things go wrong, if we're seeing, you know, issues of non-inclusion, that there are opportunities to learn, there are opportunities to grow. And you know, part of this, I think, you know, in adopting a new approach is about letting go of some of the old ways. So maybe one of the reasons why we're not spending so much time in the with and the by is because we're spending too much time shoring up the to and the for. You know, it's remarkable to me, you know, it's just having spent so much time in my life trying to reform systems, that every minute I spend trying to reform an institution is time lost reseeding associational life in a community. And wherever I have had most success in reforming an institution, it's where the associational life of the community has been really, really strong. And those associations have democratically been able to sit with institutions and say, let's figure out what we need to do to get to better here. Like, let's figure out not how to make things marginally better, but how do we move towards a preferred future, an alternative future? That's where things have really changed. So I think unless we're able to build that grassroots democratic voice, it's very hard to just sit in a room with other institutions and suck salvation from our own thumbs. I don't think it works that way. I don't think change works that way. Next slide, SJ, please. So we're back onto this highway, this 3-lane highway. Next slide, SJ. Okay. And I just want to say a few really quick words about what this might look like if we're trying to really nurture and grow the by space as well as the with space, and then kind of get to a point where we're legitimizing our institutions, because there are times when things need to be done for and to, but we know very clearly that if our police and our fire and our public health can't be legitimized to do their job, you know, then their job becomes very hard to do. If we have conspiracy theorists, if we have people out on the streets, if we have people actively revolting against, if we have people kind of occupying the parks and basically just cracking on and being individualistic and flouting the public health guidelines, then it doesn't matter how much the institution tries to do its work. Without being legitimized by the public, it can't. So how do you get that legitimacy? You get it by having really good health and really good, healthful, I should say, and trustful relationships in the with and the by space. So the with and the by space enables and legitimizes the times when we have to do things for people and to people. When they're strong, people will say, yeah, we get right now, these rules need to be in place, and we'll conform to them, because we've had long-standing relationships with you where you've recognized our creativity, our contribution, our civic voice. That's how it works. Now, sometimes you can precipitate that through fear. So immediately, if there's a crisis, if there's a war, if people are fearful that they're going to die, people will comply with the rules. But that will only last so long. Then eventually the heroism dips and you get into the valley of disillusion. And we got into that over the winter. And that will either plateau off, or we'll be able to create something that isn't about heroism and isn't about delusional or disillusionment, but is about participation. And I hope it's about participation, quite frankly, and collaboration. So how do we do that? Well, one of the ways we do that is to shift the conversation away, and many of you know this already, from the medical model, what's the matter with you, to what matters to you. But I would say we need to go further to the good life conversation, which is saying, what matters to you that you'd like to contribute to others? It's really interesting, and Steve would know more about this than I would, but it's really interesting to look at the well-being component of the experience somebody has when they contribute to the well-being of others. That actually, if you look at recovery from addiction, for example, that the opportunity to contribute to other people's recovery enables our own recovery. So it's really interesting that well-being isn't something that's just individualistic. It's not, we don't experience well-being as an island of individual health. We experience it communally. And so part of what we have to do is change the conversation from what service do you want or what's wrong with you to what good life would you like and how can we support you to create that. And this is really important. This takes us much deeper and way beyond this idea that we'll refer you to an activity because you're lonely. No, that's not the conversation we need to have. The conversation we need to have is, you've got a gift to contribute to the well-being of your community. My job, my privilege, is to help you discover that. And my job also is to work with the community to receive that gift. Because I want you to be in activities where on the day you don't show up, you're missed, and members of that group reach out to find out what's going on. In other words, I want to precipitate community alternatives to my institutional intervention in your life. That's the difference. Next slide, Esther. We'll go through pretty quickly. So that's where the first question comes in there. So it's a learning conversation. And I think to do that really well as shifting, say, for example, our social work teams away from case management social work to community social work. And I think that's happening already. Back almost that patch social work model that we had many, many moons ago. Some of you are old enough to remember this. But moving in that direction is kind of critical. Next slide, SJ, please. I keep coming back to these three questions because they're so critical. So how do we move beyond, and I'll finish on this, how do we move beyond just kind of talking where, you know, the third sector, the public sector, the institutional world, the faith community, talk to the public, to kind of getting to a point where we're really having conversations and we're enabling conversations at neighborhood level. Let me say in brief, and then we'll finalize on this. I think it begins by recognizing that the best way to build community is at the scale of the local neighborhood, the village, the small place. And that begins with two key things. The first is shifting away from finding leaders to finding connectors. In every single neighborhood, there are connectors. Most of them are behind the scenes people who do not go to meetings and who do not seek the limelight of leadership. And there's nothing wrong with leadership, but they don't seek it. They're more interested in building relationships between people who are not connected than getting out of their way. And in every single neighborhood that I've ever worked in, and I've worked in thousands, there are connectors. My money would be on finding them first and enabling, because they are the glue of the neighborhood, enabling them to actually do their magic more effectively. The second is, I would put a lot of emphasis on finding community builders, community animators, there's different words for them, but paid people who really understand how to do this work at neighborhood level, who are prepared to be in the neighborhood, perhaps with a laptop and a mobile phone, but largely to be located in the neighborhood, busy weaving the social tapestry back again, person by person, gift by gift, neighborhood by neighborhood, association by association. they're the two key things. There are others that I'd love to have more time to talk about, including shifting the way we commission, which is a really, really important kind of narrative. But that's the work we're doing throughout the UK now with local authorities, and really beginning to change the nature of that. So I'll stop there because I'm mindful that we've only got about 7 minutes left here. But perhaps we could go back to you and I having a conversation, Steve, and picking up some questions.
Indeed, there's so much to talk about there. One thing that I've learned, I've been doing this for some years, and particularly in the housing field, one thing that we found out was one of the challenges that came to us was the boundaries that were put upon us by legislative requirements. And looking at the map of to and for and with and by, effectively it was always by that was the first one to have to take the budget cuts, because there was a legislative requirement to provide the services to. And so for me, this takes some courage at a political level and at local authority level, although even taking interpretation of law to say, okay, we need to prioritise by as much as we prioritise to. Would you agree with that?
Totally, totally. And it's interesting as well, in legislative terms, if you look at the laws around charities in the UK, it is legally not possible to put the precipitation of the by space into your objects. You literally have to describe what you're doing as some form of relief action, which means you're going to do something for communities. So I think at all kinds of levels, the to and the for are essentially elevated over in terms of importance on the by and the with. And I think you're right. It's politically, it's about courage to create the space and the legitimizing functions to say, this is the way we're going, and we're going to give you the cover to work this way. So public sector need to be saying to the third sector, this is the way we're going, and we'll give you cover. Because I think often what has happened as well is a kind of a perversity in what you're describing, is that the public sector have essentially said to the third sector, we trust you, we know you're a little bit closer to the ground, we want you to do this, but we want you to do it in our image and likeness and follow these rules, which is basically making the third sector the handmaid of the public sector and using it as a proxy for community, instead of saying, well, actually, do you know what? You're not the voice of community. The third sector isn't the voice of community, but you have the capacity to build the amplification system for the voice of the community. And that's where we want to support you. So you're right, it's going to take political courage.
Quite a fundamental one. How do you know if it's working? What are the criteria you set by it works in this area? How do you know that?
Well, 7 years ago, when the Broken Britain narrative was very, very strong, and an expose of a community in Firs and Bromford was carried in one of the national broadsheets, you could palpably feel in that outer estate that sense of disillusion and shame that they felt of being named in those ways. But today, if you go into that community 7 years on, having had a huge amount of really astonishingly good community building work, what you first feel is the sense of agency in the people that you meet. There's more associational life, more people doing things together. The associations are more likely to actually talk with each other and work together. And there's a different tenor in the conversation between the folks that are sharing their vision, because that's another evidence, if you like. There's actually a coherent neighborhood plan that the community buy into because they've created. But there's a different tenor to the conversation between them and Birmingham City Council, which is the largest city council in Europe, as you know. And I think it's a tenor that says it's more respectful, quite frankly, but it's less shouty. So it kind of feels less about the community feeling on the back foot. There's a confidence in the voice of the community. And I hear that coming through even at this very early stage in Colville too, even though they're only a year into the process, really. This kind of sense of, it's the difference between assertiveness and aggression. It feels more assertive more civic, and we need more civic voices and less aggression and less uncivil tones. So, but it also feels to me like more stuff is getting done. You know, so it's amazing how quickly we cancel each other out when we argue who should be doing it, and how quickly things move along when communities say, "No, we'll take that because that's ours. So just remove the barriers. We'll crack on and do that. No, that stuff we can't do. We need a bit of help with that. Crack on with that. And then that stuff that's yours, and you know, we'll happily cheer you on that." It just, you see a better, more efficient delivery of services, actually, interestingly, as well as better outcomes. Now also, and I can share a report on this, the evidence. So the Scottish government paid quite a princely ransom to really analyze our work for 3 years. And there's a report on that. And to my amazement, one of the other things that happened in the neighborhoods where the community building was happening was across the population, there was an improvement in mental health. Now, so this isn't just the people that were engaged in the activities, across the population. So this is indication of population health change. And that's really, that is the $64 million question everybody has at the moment, right? But it goes to culture. So as the social cohesion improved, it had a ripple effect, which went much further than we took. Now, I can't promise that will happen in every instance, but we have an evidential base that it happened in that.
But just in closing, I would just like to give you the opportunity to reflect on something. You tweeted over the weekend and mentioned earlier something about Maslow, which is very much based on an individual's hierarchy of needs. But in doing so, you also commented that actually Maslow, I'm going to say was inspired by, because nicked an idea is probably be pejorative, but was inspired by an idea that came from North American Indians about the fact that actually there is something about community that is in us that overrides sometimes our individuality.
That's right. That's right. The Blackfoot Nation. He spent about 6 months, and really, I think would have learned through being with them the importance of situating this idea that of Ubuntu. Really, this is I am I because we are we. This principle that if you think about being sort of brought into the world as a human being, sort of randomly thought of as an individual, is one model, and that's the Western model. The other is that actually you're brought into the world with a spark of genius. It's something uniquely within you that you can contribute to the well-being of your community, and in doing so, you yourself become well. And that's the indigenous wisdom, the indigenous principle, which I love, because it also has a great way of helping us think about how we can be kinder to the planet. So that wisdom, I think, is important to pay attention to. But Maslow, for whatever reason, sidestepped that and went into a much more individualistic hierarchy.
And did quite well out of it as well, it must be said.
Yeah.
So in closing, really, I've just got to say thank you so much for just starting this conversation. We look forward to the pandemic being over, so you can actually come over and visit us. We'd like to be able to take this to the next stage. But I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank people who've helped put this together, particularly Drew Mellor, the council leader, who can't be with us today. There's been some problems with the technology, that the systems have not been compatible. Jane Kelly, who has been instrumental in making this happen. So thank you, Jane. We look forward to continuing that. But also within the wider community, Karen Loftus, who's the Chief Executive of CAN, has been promoting this and supporting this. Karen, we're very sorry, along with Alistair, the representative of FaithWorks and the faith sector, that you haven't been able to be a part of this. We look forward to fixing that next time we meet. And Sam Crowe, Director of Public Health, we're so sorry that you haven't been able to be part of this, along with everybody else that tried to log in today. We've been successful. Well over 100 people have been a part of the session, but from what I'm getting, there were maybe another 150 more who are just finding out and wanting to know more about this. So for everybody that has been a part of this, please spread the word. We want to do more of these. We want to develop this more and more, but we want to do it in consultation, because the whole point of this is not saying that we are now going to do something in a different way. And I'm sure that the council would never say that. This is about saying, what do you think? How do you think? How do we start these sparks of individuality off within communities? How do we fan the flames? How do we nurture this without taking control over something? Now, I'm just third sector in one charity, but I know that the faith sector, the third sector as a whole, is fascinated and eager to see this happen. And so would just applaud and encourage our colleagues at council level just to sort of keep on going with this, despite the technological difficulties, despite the challenges that we have, because there is something in this that is worth taking forward. There are the sparks that are happening that we want to see fanned into flames. And finally today, I'd just like to say thank you to SJ, who's been the producer of today, who's probably going to have to go away and have a couple of paracetamol now, but thank you, SJ, for pulling all this together. Cormac, thank you so much for your time today. It's been so appreciated.
It's a pleasure. We've
learned a lot. I'm surrounded by questions we haven't had time to do. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thanks, SJ. Thanks, everybody. Take care.